I was at a tech conference with hundreds of people discussing the future of innovation when I first met Daniel. It was a crisp evening with a hint of the ocean in late autumn in San Francisco, and when we started talking, it seemed like the rest of the room vanished. He had a quiet intensity about him, a depth that drew me in from the moment our eyes met. I felt seen and understood in a way I hadn't felt in years. Our romance was quick and easy. Thrilling, full of impromptu adventures and late-night drives, I still recall the time we went on a road trip up the coast with no plan, just going wherever the road led, and we ended up in a small coastal town sitting on the beach with a single blanket and drinking cheap wine we got at a gas station. I felt like the luckiest woman alive, like we were invincible. Those are the memories I cling to today as if holding onto a lifeline, and 2 years later, we got married and moved into our sunlit apartment in the city full of dreams about the life we were going to create together were ideal, or at least it appeared to be ideal. He was deeply involved in software engineering, and I was specializing in UX design. We discussed starting a business together, possibly developing a product that would transform people's lives, and we spent hours brainstorming over takeout dinner, sprawled on our living room floor with sketches and sticky notes all over the place, but eventually we stopped. Daniel's startup took off, and all of a sudden, he was spending more nights at work than at home. At first, I was proud of him because I knew how much he loved his job and how much it meant to him to see his ideas come to fruition. I tried to be understanding and supportive, but gradually things changed. He would come home late, exhausted, and collapse onto the couch without even saying goodnight. Our conversations became shorter and more focused on work updates than on intimacy or laughter. It was like living with a ghost of the man I married. A knot tightened in my chest as I watched him from across the room, wanting to scream and throw the plate against the wall to get a reaction. But instead I forced a smile and told him I understood, and perhaps I did. I remember one evening standing in the kitchen chopping vegetables waiting for him to come home. I had made his favorite spaghetti carbonara, but he barely gave me a glance before going straight to his laptop and mumbling something about a deadline. Understandably, I made an effort to immerse myself in my work by taking on more clients and projects. If he was going to lose himself in his work, then so would I. I began working longer hours at the design firm, finding solace in the creative process and the compliments I received from my team. It was during the late nights and pressure-filled deadlines that I first met Ethan, a boss who took notice of everything. He came to work first and left last, but he had a magnetic energy. I initially thought he was just another demand executive, but then he began paying attention to me in a way that felt different. At first, it was small things like him stopping by my desk to compliment my designs or send me a quick text after a particularly good presentation. "You nailed it today, Ava." He thrived on the adrenaline of high-stakes projects because he loved it, and he expected the same from everyone around him. "They would be lost without you." I'd smile at my phone feeling a flutter of something. After we finished a long project, Ethan suggested that we all go out for drinks to celebrate. It wasn't uncommon for the team to relax in this way, so I agreed without giving it much thought. We ended up at a hip little bar close to the office, the kind of place with dim lighting and jazz playing softly in the background. It was flattering, to be sure, but more than that, it was validation and a reminder that I was good at what I did, that someone noticed me in a way Daniel no longer did. He asked me about my life, my hobbies, and the things that made me tick. I told him about the road trips I used to take with Daniel and the art gallery I'd always wanted to visit in New York, but never found the time. He listened intently, his eyes locked on mine, and he nodded in a way that made me feel like I was the only person in the room as the night wore on. I went to get a drink and settled into a plush seat, feeling the stress of the week melt away. The bar began to empty out, and I realized with a start that it was almost midnight. I checked my phone, but there were no messages from Daniel or missed calls, so I wondered if he even realized I wasn't home yet. Ethan smiled and leaned closer, and I felt a warmth in my cheeks that wasn't related to the gene. "I suppose that makes two of us." His words lingered in the air, and for a moment, I was at a loss for words. He reached out and lightly touched my arm, and even though it was a small gesture, it sent a shiver down my spine. "Ava, just so you know, you're amazing. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." I drove home that night with my heart thumping in my chest, replaying his words over and over, telling myself it was nothing. It was insignificant, but it made me realize how long it had been since someone touched me with that kind of intention. "I should go," I said, standing up too quickly, the room spinning slightly from the drinks. Ethan looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He nodded, stepping back, giving me space, of course. Daniel was sleeping on the couch with his laptop open next to him. He hadn't even bothered to go to bed, so I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of all the unspoken words between us. I wanted to wake him up and tell him how I felt to shake him out of this fog he was living in, but instead I turned off the light and went to bed alone that night. Just a compliment that didn't mean anything, but as I parked the car and walked into our apartment, the silence struck me like a wall. That night at work was one of the worst I'd had in months. I had been juggling 3 different client projects, each of which required my full attention. I was exhausted and my head was pounding, but I was also proud of the work I'd done. The team had come together, and we were able to meet a deadline that seemed impossible only a few weeks earlier. When the final email was sent, a collective sigh of relief filled the room, and Ethan leaned against my desk, smiling like a child. I hesitated, looking at the time, realizing that it was already late and Daniel would be home by now, possibly even waiting for me. But the idea of returning to the quiet of our apartment to the silence that had become the norm between us made me feel oddly empty. He had that look when a project went well, his eyes sparkling with a kind of manic energy, and he said, "Drinks are on me tonight. We actually pulled it off." I looked up at Ethan, whose smile was wide and inviting. We took a booth in the corner away from the rest of the team, who were already gathered at the bar ordering rounds of shots. Ethan ordered us both gin and tonics without asking, as if he already knew what I'd want. It was a small detail, but it made me feel noticed. Something inside me clicked, and I said, surprising even myself with one drink. The bar Ethan chose was one of those upscale, dimly lit places you only find in the heart of the city. It was quiet, the kind of place where the music is soft and the conversations are hushed. It was easy, comfortable, the kind of banter we often shared in the office. But as the night wore on and the drinks kept coming in, our conversation began to change. Ethan leaned close, "Sir," lowering his voice as if sharing a secret tracing the rim of his glass with his nose. We clinked glasses and I took a long sip, letting the drink wash away the stress of the day. For the first 30 minutes, we talked about work, celebrating the project, and laughing about the small mistakes we caught at the last minute. "I've been meaning to tell you this for a while. Ava, you're one of the most talented designers I've ever worked with, and I don't just mean your abilities. I mean the way you think and approach problems. It's rare." I felt a warmth spread through me that was part alcohol and part something else. I looked down, embarrassed by the intensity of his gaze. I muttered, "You're just saying that," but he shook his head and said, "I'm not." There was a brief silence that made, "You're very conscious of your own heartbeat." I looked at the bar where our coworkers were still laughing and chatting, unaware of the change that had just occurred between us. "Tell me about Daniel, Ethan." He said something unexpected that caught me off guard. I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "What do you mean?" He shrugged, leaning back against the booth. "You never talk about him. I know you're married, but it's like he's not really a part of your life." I bristled at his words, feeling the defensive walls go up almost automatically. Daniel was a part of my life, but a part that had begun to fade over time, like a photograph. "I don't mean to pry, but I've seen the way you look when you talk about your work and the things you're passionate about. I've never seen that look when you mention him, and I felt like he'd struck a nerve I didn't even know was exposed." I took a long sip of my drink. I apologized to Ethan for saying that more sharply than I intended, but I knew there was some truth to what he was saying. Ethan nodded, watching me with a look I couldn't quite read, as if he was seeing through all the excuses I'd made, all the reasons I'd given myself for why Daniel and I had drifted apart. "It sounds lonely," he said softly, and that one word hit me like a punch to the gut. I've been trying to find the right words lately, and I admitted that it was the first time I'd said it out loud, and it felt like a betrayal, even though it was the truth. Ethan reached across the table, his fingers brushing against mine, and it felt like a spark igniting dry tinder. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and saw something there that I hadn't seen in a long time, desire raw and unfiltered. so I said abruptly, pulling my hand back as if I'd been burned. He nodded without protesting and got up tossing, until someone else said it aloud. I looked away, blinking back the sudden sting of tears. The city was quiet now, the streets almost deserted, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling vulnerable in a way I couldn't explain. Ethan stood too close, his eyes locked on mine for a moment, neither of us moving, the tension between us thick and palpable. I knew what was coming and I knew I should stop it. I should say something, do something to break the spell, but I didn't. He leaned and slowly. I felt his warm, intoxicating breath on my lips, and before I knew it, his mouth was on mine. The kiss was brief, just a gentle kiss, but it felt like an electric current jolting through my body. I gasped and pulled back, my heart pounding in my chest. We stood there looking at each other, breathing heavily, as if we had just run a marathon. "I'm sorry," Ethan whispered, looking as shaken as I felt I shouldn't have done that. I shook my head, putting distance between us. When I got home, Daniel was in bed with his laptop's soft glow shining on his face. He looked up briefly when I walked in, giving me a weary smile. "It's fine," I stammered, even though it wasn't fine at all. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, none of which were coherent. "I'll see you at the office," I managed to say before turning away and moving quickly down the sidewalk, needing to put as much space between us as possible. He said, "Distant fine," and I slipped into the bathroom before he could see my flushed face and shaking hands. I locked the door and leaned against the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror for the first time. After the kiss outside the bar, I couldn't recognize the woman looking back at me. I spent the next few days trying to forget it. I forced myself to focus all of my energy on new designs and client presentations, telling myself it was a moment of poor judgment. Weakness brought on by the stress and exhaustion of that night, but every time I saw Ethan across the office or my phone buzzed with a new message, I would remember his lips on mine, the heat of his breath, and how the world seemed to blur around us. It was as if the kiss had roused something inside of me that I couldn't put back to sleep. I knew I should have told him to stop texting me, that we needed to keep a professional distance, but instead I found myself reading his messages late at. They weren't inappropriate, at least not explicitly, but there was a tone and familiarity that hadn't existed before, and I didn't do anything to dissuade them. Then one afternoon, Ethan casually brought up the idea of the work retreat, as if it were just another idea thrown into our project planning session. "The team has been under a lot of pressure lately," he said, smiling and looking around the room. "I think we deserve a break, a chance to reset and recharge. What about a beach retreat? Nothing too formal, just a weekend at the beach." The team was buzzing with excitement right away because it had been a long few months, and the idea of getting away from the city for a few days sounded like heaven. However, I hesitated, feeling a pang of anxiety twist in my gut. The idea of spending a whole weekend near Ethan after everything that had happened made my pulse quicken, and even though I knew it was risky, I still found myself nodding along with everyone else and plastering on a smile. I forced myself to say, "Sounds great," telling myself that I could handle it and wouldn't let things get out of control. What I didn't anticipate, though, was Daniel's reaction when I told him about the retreat that evening over dinner. He looked up from his plate and said, "That sounds nice, a weekend at the beach." His tone was lighter than it had been in weeks, "So maybe I'll come along. It would be good for us." Don't you think I almost choked on my own words when I hadn't even considered the possibility that Daniel might want to join? In the days before the retreat, I felt like I was walking a tightrope balancing between the life I shared with Daniel and the unresolved tension simmering between Ethan and me. For a moment, I considered making up an excuse and telling him it was a work-on trip, but something in his eyes gave me pause, a flicker of hope of effort I hadn't seen in so long. He was reaching out trying to close the gap that had grown between us, and I couldn't bring myself to shut him down. The resort was stunning. We arrived late in the afternoon, with the sun just setting over the ocean, casting everything in a golden light. The property was perched high on the cliffs with private cabanas. I kept thinking about the kiss, wondering what it meant, if it meant anything at all, and whether Ethan felt the same turmoil I did. He didn't mention it in the office and didn't give any indication that anything had happened, but there was an unspoken understanding in the way his eyes met mine, a shared secret that neither of us acknowledged. He took my hand as we walked to our room, and I felt a pang of guilt twist in my chest. He was trying, and I could see it in the way he looked at me, the little nervous smiles he kept giving me as if he wasn't sure what to say. We hadn't been this close in months, but the physical distance between us felt greater than ever. The first evening was filled with laughter and the scent of salt and jasmine, scattered along the edge overlooking the sea. Long tables were set up under string lights for our team dinner on the terrace, and everyone was sipping cocktails and telling stories. Daniel sat next to me, his arm casually draped over the back of my chair. For a short while, everything seemed normal. I caught glimpses of Ethan across the table, but he avoided looking at me directly, as if he was trying to avoid eye contact. I wasn't sure if that made me happy or sad, but later that evening, when the dinner was over and everyone had gone to their rooms, the tension. After spending the entire evening at bay, Daniel came back with a vengeance. He was exhausted, kissed my forehead, and said he was going to turn in early. I told him I needed some alone time, and he nodded, squeezing my hand before vanishing inside. I stood on the balcony, leaning against the railing, listening to the waves crash against the cliffs below. The moon was full, creating a silver path across the water, and the sight of it made me feel both small and limitless. I closed my eyes and took A. My heart was lurching in my chest as I took a deep breath to try to calm the storm inside of me. Ava. Ethan was standing in the shadows, his face partially illuminated by the moonlight. He took a step closer, and I felt a shock of electricity go through me. I should have said something to stop this before it started, but the words wouldn't come. I whispered, "You shouldn't be here," but my voice betrayed me. It was soft, almost pleading. He moved closer, his eyes searching mine. "I had to see you," he said in a low, rough voice. I haven't been able to stop thinking. I wanted to say that I hadn't either, but I bit my lip and shook my head, saying, "This is wrong." Even as my body leaned toward him, pulled by an unseen force, I couldn't help but step into the light, and he whispered, "Tell me you don't want this. Tell me to leave, and I will." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Instead, I closed my eyes, felt his breath on my lips, felt the warmth of his body so close to mine, and then he kissed me. Wasn't like the first. It was slower and more deliberate, as if he was enjoying every moment. I melted into him, holding onto the front of his shirt and drawing him closer. The world around us vanished, including the sound of the waves and the cool breeze, as well as the other guests' distant laughter. It was just the two of us, locked in this moment, which felt endless and fleeting. Suddenly, we broke apart, and I pulled back, my heart racing, breathless, and flushed. Ethan stepped back to his chest. I whispered, "We can't keep doing this," but it felt like a lie because he nodded and swallowed hard. "I know," I said, but we both knew the truth. The line had already been crossed, and there was no turning back. I slipped back inside, the warmth of the kiss still lingering on my lips. Daniel was already asleep, his breathing steady and gentle. I climbed into bed next to him, being careful not to wake him, and for the first time, I couldn't deny it any longer. Wanted something that I couldn't have, and I wasn't sure if I could stop myself from taking it. Going back to the city felt like waking up from a dream. The beach retreat had been a surreal time that existed outside of reality, but as soon as we got home, it felt like the weight of the everyday world had fallen back on me. The office's harsh fluorescent lights, the city's noise, and the incessant pings of emails were all too vivid and sharp, but everything else felt muted, and I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss. When I was alone in the car, standing in the shower, or lying next to Daniel in bed, staring at the ceiling while he slept, Daniel tried to re-establish himself in his own way. He asked if I wanted to go out to dinner or watch a movie with him. I said yes, of course, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. I kept replaying it in my head, the way Ethan's hands had cued my face, the warmth of his lips, and the way time seemed to pause when we were together. Daniel appeared more preoccupied than ever, putting himself into his work and coming home late with a look of exhaustion etched in his features. When he kissed me goodnight, it was a quick, perfunctory gesture rather than a gesture of love, and I would lie awake wondering if he felt the same way. We would fill the silence with meaningless small talk about the food and his work and mine, pretending it was enough, but it wasn't anymore. Then came Ethan's texts. They began as lighthearted banter about the retreat and remarks about a meeting we'd both attended, but they soon turned into something more. Late at night, after I turned off the lights, my phone would buzz on the nightstand, and I'd pick it up, heart racing, to see his name thinking about you. He would text with a winking emoji or just, "I can't get you out of my head." I should have ignored them, told him to stop that. It wasn't appropriate that we couldn't continue doing this, but I didn't. Instead, I would lie in the dark typing back messages, my thumbs shaking as I hit send. It felt like I was two different people. One who wanted to maintain my marriage with Daniel and keep my life together, and another who craved the excitement and danger of my relationship with Ethan. One afternoon, Ethan texted me while I was in a meeting. 5 minutes later, I looked at the message, feeling a surge of heat go through the conference room, which he mentioned was rarely used, was tucked away in a corner of the building with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. It was a private, quiet place where no one would think to look for us. I looked around the room while my colleagues were absorbed in the presentation on the screen, and for a moment, I hesitated, my phone heavy in my hand, remembering Daniel's tired smile and the way he'd kissed me goodbye that morning. I got up, muttering something about having to take a call, and slipped out of the room before I could change my mind. The walk to the 18th floor felt like forever, and I could hear my heart thumping so loudly in my ears. When I finally arrived at the conference room door, I took a deep breath to try to calm the tremor in my hands, and then I pushed the door open slowly. Ethan was already there, standing by the windows with his back to me, staring at them. He turned when he heard me, a slow smile spreading across his face as the afternoon light poured in, casting long shadows across the floor. I nodded, swallowing hard, and he said softly, "You came?" I nodded, but even as I said it, I knew it was a lie, because I wanted to be there more than anything. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine for hesitation, and he said, silently, "Tell me to walk out of here, and I will." I opened my mouth, but no sound came out, so I took a step toward. That was all it took for him to be on me in an instant. His hands were tangled in my hair, drawing me in, and his mouth smashed into mine. Not gently this time, but urgently demanding, as if all the tension and unsaid words between us had boiled over and spilled out in that kiss. I kissed him back just as frantically, my hands gripping the front of his shirt, drawing him in. It was reckless and wild, but I didn't care because I couldn't look past the sensation of his lips on my skin. We both knew exactly what we were doing, and neither of us seemed willing to stop. He broke the kiss, pressing his forehead against mine while we were both breathing heavily. "I've wanted this for a long time," he said, his voice rough as if he had been holding back a storm. "I know," I whispered back, feeling the stubble beneath my fingertips as I traced the line of his jaw. He kissed me again, slower this time, savoring it as if he wanted to commit the taste of me to memory. The world faded away as I melted into him, and it was just the two of us in that room, and nothing else mattered. But then the spell broke, and I heard footsteps outside the door and voices in the hallway. I pulled back, my heart pounding, and I realized that we were going to crash back down on me. "We can't do this," I said, my voice trembling, but even as I said it, I didn't move away. Instead, he cued my face in his hands, making me look at him. "There we already are," he said simply, and I didn't want to stop, nor did I. I knew then that we had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, that no matter what happened next, there was no turning back. I had stepped off the edge of a cliff, and there was no way to stop the fall. I left the conference room first, my hands shaking as I smoothed down my hair and tried to gather myself. The hallway was empty, but it felt like everyone could see right through me, as if the truth was written on my face. I hurried back to my desk, sat down, and I put my phone face down on the desk and took a deep breath, but it didn't help because I already knew the truth. I wasn't falling anymore. I had already hit the ground. I'm not sure when the exhaustion started, but at first it was subtle, a persistent tiredness that I chalked up to the stress of the project, the late hours. I was staring at my computer screen when Ethan's message buzzed on my phone a few moments later, the words blurring in front of me. "I need more of this, more of you." I didn't reply. I couldn't because I needed it too. The past few weeks have been an emotional roller coaster. I've experienced unusual dizziness and nausea at random times, which I've dismissed as nerves or possibly a bug I picked up somewhere. As the days went by, the symptoms worsened, and I'd spend mornings hunched over the bathroom sink, swallowing back the bile that rose in my throat in the hopes that Daniel wouldn't notice. One morning, after almost passing out in the shower, I realized I couldn't keep acting like nothing was wrong, so I put on a coat and drove to the pharmacy. Hands shaking, I avoided making eye contact with the cashier as I walked down the aisle, grabbed the first pregnancy test I saw, stuffed it into my bag like it was a contraband item, and rushed back to my car, which was sitting in the parking lot. I felt a wave of shame and fear as I drove home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, the world around me a blur, and I waited until Daniel left for work. When the 2 pink lines appeared clear as day, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at the little plastic stick for what felt like the longest moments of my life. My breath left me in a rush, as if I had been punched in the gut. The word positive echoed in my mind like a siren, a warning I couldn't escape. I sank to the floor, clutching the test, my thoughts a chaotic mess. What should have been a moment of joy and excitement was instead, I felt cold creeping dread because I didn't know who the father was. I spent the next few days in a daze, going through the motions at work with a smile that felt like it might burst at any moment. Ethan realized something was wrong. Of course he did, and one afternoon he cornered me in the hallway, his eyes narrowing in concern. "Ava, what's going on?" he asked quietly, reaching for whatever it was. Daniel or Ethan, my husband or my lover, the man I built my life with or the man I couldn't seem to let go of. He didn't seem convinced that we needed to talk, so I pulled away with a laugh and said, "It's nothing. I'm just tired," I lied. At last, my voice was barely above a whisper, and he nodded, his expression serious, and I felt a twinge of guilt twist in my chest. He looked so sure and confident that nothing could shake him, and he had no idea what I was about to tell him. After work, we met at a quiet rooftop bar with twinkling string lights and a view of the city that stretched out into the horizon. We sat in silence for a moment, the city noise humming below us like a distant echo, and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, a wild, erratic drum beat that made it difficult to breathe. "Ava," he said finally, leaning closer, "what's going on? You're scaring me." It felt ironic to be sitting there with a secret that could destroy everything. Ethan ordered us drinks, but I pushed mine away because the thought of alcohol made my stomach turn. I tried to find the right words as I looked at him, but they stuck in my throat like glass fragments. "I'm pregnant," I blurted out the words before I could stop them. His expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. For a moment, he was completely unreadable, as if he had been hit by a wave of shock so strong that it erased every expression. Then, slowly, his self-assured exterior broke down, and he blinked, opening and closing his mouth as though he were trying to form a sentence, but he couldn't find the words. He sat there for a long time, staring out at the skyline as if the answer he needed was hidden somewhere in the city lights. When he finally turned back to me, the confident, self-assured Ethan I knew was gone. He looked shaken, almost fragile, like a man who had just lost his sense of self. He was testing the word on his tongue, leaning back in his chair and running a hand through his hair. "Are you sure?" I nodded, feeling the sting of tears in my eyes. I took the test 3 times. Ethan's face crumpled, his hands balled into fists on the table, and he muttered, "Jesus, Ava, what the hell are we going to do?" while dragging a hand over his face. "I don't know," I said, putting my lips together and shaking my head. "It could be yours or it could be Daniel's." The silence that followed was oppressive, and I could feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on us like a thick fog settling over everything. I wanted to believe him, to rely on the promise of his words, to find solace in the warmth of his hand on mine, but the truth was already hitting me hard, settling like a stone in my stomach. He reached across the table and took my hand in his grip tight and desperate. "I'm here for you," he said, but there was a hint of panic in his voice, a raw fear he couldn't hide. "Whatever happens, we'll figure this out together." We sat there for a while without saying anything, the city passing by as if nothing had changed, but I could see it in the way Ethan looked at me now. There was a flicker of something I couldn't quite place, maybe out of fear or regret, but it was as if he was watching the future unfold before him, and it wasn't what he'd imagined. Eventually, he got up and squeezed my hand one last time before letting go. "I need to go," he said in a hollow voice, and I should assume that I nodded. When I finally arrived home, Daniel was sitting on the couch with the TV on, but his face was muted by the flicker of the screen. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes softening with concern. "You look tired," he said, getting up and coming over to kiss my forehead. "Rough day," I nodded, swallowing back the words, watching him walk away and staring out at the city lights with the cold wind tearing through my hair. I felt more alone than I had ever felt before, the weight of the decision pressing down on me from all sides. I had a lump in my throat, so I said softly and allowed him to take me into his arms. As I stood there, feeling his heartbeat steadily against my cheek, I realized with a sinking sense of cold certainty that this was just the beginning of the fallout. I had to make a decision, but I had no idea how to go about it or even where to begin. All I knew was that the life I had created was falling apart piece by piece, and there was nothing I could do about it. I had no one to blame but myself.